Next, let's think about what was being said. These are our observations. And so many of us, when we've learned Bible study methods, this is kind of one of the main things that we do. All right, we begin to learn how to observe what was going on in the text. And so when we think about observations, though, and we think about the different genres, there's a few different things that we want to do depending upon the genre. And so I'll make these available, these little sheets available to you. But this is the kind of the grid, the kinds of questions, kind of things we want to look for in epistles. All right. So the Pauline letters and other letters in the New Testament. So we want to think through keywords or phrases. We want to, it doesn't matter if you circle these or whatever, but we want to take note of the keywords and phrases that are central to the meaning of the passage. Repeated terms or concepts may provide a clue. And we're going to talk about repetition a little bit later as well. But are there key things here? We will think about Ephesians 2, 1 through 10 a little bit later in our videos, and a key phrase there for by grace you have been saved, used twice. And that's a key phrase central to the meaning of that passage. Connectives, again, we want to think about connectives. Connectives reveal important relationships. They're like for, because, or therefore, often indicating a reason or a cause. Therefore, we always want to ask the question, what's the therefore? We never want to read the therefore and just read the isolated paragraph that we're in. The therefore points backward to what's just been said before. But, it often introduces a contrast. We're going to talk about contrast comparisons next, so that to, in order to, often indicates purpose. So these are some connectives that we want to think through, and we want to think through why are they there? What are they doing? Contrast and comparisons. How does the writer use contrast, comparisons, and illustrations to amplify the concepts he wants to communicate? Comparison is the association of similar things, or contrast the association of things that are different. In Ephesians 2, that we're going to look at a little bit later, there's a huge contrast with the but God in verse 4. You were dead in your trespasses and sins, walking in the course of the world, so on and so forth, but God establishes a huge contrast with the word but. However, then, rather, or on the other hand, indicate contrast. Like and as indicate comparison. Repetition. Are there repeated words or phrases? Are there repeated thoughts? Again, the author was not just, it's not like the author couldn't think of another word to use. These are words that are very intentionally repeated in order to emphasize certain things, okay? Advice, commands, warnings, promises. Note the advice or admonitions the author gives. What does the author ask the readers to do? What role do warnings or promises play in the admonitions? Is there a warning or a promise? What role does it play? So think about commands in particular. Again, we'll look at Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. There's no commands in that passage. It's just this incredible, the glory. It's almost like Paul couldn't contain himself as to what God did. And so I think of Romans 1 through 6, or really 1 through 12. There's just a few commands in 6. The majority of it is all that God has done for us in the gospel. And so the absence of commands says something almost sometimes as much as the presence of commands. Reasons, results, cause, and effects is the next one. When you observe admonitions, see if the writer gives you a reason for this advice. Is there a benefit that will result from following the writer's instructions? Is there danger to be avoided? Is there a cause and effect relationship if then? So we want to think through these types of things as it relates to reasons, results, cause, and effects. We want to think through the progression of ideas. Take note of ideas that are listed. Does there seem to be any significance to the order of these things that are listed? Illustrations. Are there any illustrations? What imagery or images does the author employ? I think again of Romans 6, and I think the members of your body. I think of the temple imagery that's used in different places. I think of Romans 12 about the living sacrifice. Again, I think Paul is pointing back to the sacrificial system in the Old Testament. So these are all illustrations that are used. Questions. What is the purpose behind the question? to challenge, to introduce an idea, to anticipate an objection, to raise a problem. Does the author answer the question explicitly or implicitly? And so, again, Paul does this all through Romans, particularly the first number of chapters, first 6 chapters in particular. And so, well, our first 8 chapters that I can think of. Think of I may not be able to remember to quote it here, but Romans 8:1. Well, he says in Romans 7, let's just say this, very end of 7, he says about wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this body of death? It's a question, but he also raises questions in Romans 6. He says, shall we continue in sin that grace might increase? By no means. He answers it, and then he goes on to answer. He anticipates questions, and then he answers those all through. So he uses questions to be able to raise a perceived objection that his audience may have, and he goes to answer those things. Grammar. It is worthwhile to note direct commands and pay attention to the tense, mood, and number of verbs, as well as the case and number of nouns and pronouns. You're going to see this a little bit more in a video on begin to break down the grammar of a passage. But it's helpful to think through, again, tense and mood, past tense, future tense, things like that. Tone, how would you describe? This is, again, somewhat subjective, but how would you describe the general tone of the passage? Is it characterized by anger, delight, sadness, joy, thanksgiving, earnestness, caution, etc.? Are there statements that reveal the author's feelings? And so I think of, again, Ephesians 2, and it's this sense of delight or the celebration when Paul talks about being dead and now being alive, and for by grace you've been saved. He can't hardly contain himself. But I also think in contrast in Galatians, where there is more of an earnest, serious, almost this Paul is not playing any games, because these people were about to abandon the gospel. And so he doesn't even give thanks for them in Galatians. He just turns right into business with them. So the tone is much more serious. Pivot point. Is there a significant sudden change in direction or flow? Again, you would see this in Ephesians 2, 1 through 10 as well. This, you were dead in your sins, but now you're made alive in Christ. Again, using the but to establish that contrast. And then literary structure. Are there indicators of the author's intent, emphasis by structure? You'll also see this when we think through, when we look at the video on kind of the structure of the passage. Now, let's think about, what does this look like in terms of narratives? Okay, there's going to be some very similar things as we looked at in epistles, but there's other things that we also want to take note of in narrative. So characters. Who are the characters in the story? How are they described, presented in the narrative? Are any details provided about them that may be significant? What is the significance of any names of characters? And how do they respond to the problem, conflict in the story? So again, you think about the characters in Luke 7, of Simon the Pharisee, who invited Jesus into his house, but this no-named woman who comes in, who's all she's characterized by is the fact that she's a sinner. Okay, so who are the characters, and do they provide any clues as to what's happening in the story? Proportion. How much attention is given to parts of the story? Note shifts in the amount of space given to topics. All narratives gives more space to some events, people than others. Also notice a shift between narration and dialogue in the story. So you want to, and this goes along with pace too, so I'll describe pace and then I'll describe them together. But how does the speed of the story change? Two ways to look at this is through a wide versus zoom lens and fast versus slow speed. When a narrative slows down and zooms in, it is alerting you to pay attention to some of the most important elements of the story or the passage. And so where does that story focus? And then how much proportion is given to a particular part of the story? So there may be a part of the story that the narrator just zooms by, but then all of a sudden the story gets slow. Not slow in a boring way, but it zooms in, gives detail. It provides dialogue. There's interaction then between the people. There's not just a summary of what's going on. Now there's dialogue between people. And then maybe later the narrator zoom back out. And so these are the things that are important to be able to observe about a narrative and about maybe what the author is trying to get our attention to see. Dialogue. How does dialogue contribute to the story? Dialogue is important. Take special note of what characters say. Oftentimes the central message of the passage is given through a speech or through dialogue. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, dialogue is important. I would say an author or a narrator could have just told the story through this happened and this happened and this happened, but instead, what makes these stories is a dialogue between people. What's being made note of in the dialogue, and why could that dialogue be important to the meaning of the story? Again, here are some other things that we had related to what we look at in epistles, but repetition. So we also want to see that. One thing to note here is you can go to like Blue Letter Bible or Net Bible, and you could see repetition in the original language as well, which is vitally important to be able to see what's going on. The other thing then is keywords or phrases, questions, cause and effect decisions, consequences, connectives, character, contrast, and comparisons. These are all central to being able to observe narratives, and these are the things that are also we saw in epistles as well. So I'm not going to spend our time there. But next video, what we're going to think through then is what was being emphasized. So the structure of the passage.